Here is a design brief. Take it seriously for a minute because it is harder than it sounds. Design an animal that can live inside a human house. It has to tolerate being touched, constantly, by a species it is not related to. It has to eat roughly whatever that species is eating this century. It has to be safe around a newborn, and safe around a stranger at the door, and it has to be able to tell the difference between the two without being told. It needs to read a face built on a completely different skull. It has to work when asked, find, herd, guard, pull, carry, search, and then stop working on a single sound. It has to be able to be left alone in an empty room for 8 hours and still be pleased to see you. And it has to want all of this. Not tolerate it. Want it. You cannot get there by taming. Taming is one animal's biography.
Take a wolf cub, raise it by hand, feed it by bottle, sleep beside it, and you get an animal that tolerates you specifically, is dangerous with everyone else, and whose puppies start from zero. Every generation you would have to do the whole thing again. The brief does not ask for a tame animal. It asks for a species where the answer is already installed at birth. Nobody wrote that brief. Nobody was in charge of the project. There was no plan, no goal, and for most of its duration no writing to record it in. And the animal exists. It is lying on a sofa somewhere within a few hundred meters of you right now, running a fully functional model of a human being in its head, and it has been doing so since before agriculture, before cities, before the wheel, before anyone thought to grow a crop or fire a pot. Whatever else the dog is, it is the oldest thing our species has ever made, and we made it out of a large predator that could have gone the other way. This is a video about how deep that goes. Not the top layer, the fetching and the tail, but the parts underneath. A muscle above the eye that wolves do not have. A chemical loop that runs between two species and closes. A nose that samples the air 300 times a minute. A brain that files the word ball in a place that produces a picture of a ball. If you like animals explained with the research attached rather than the anecdotes, subscribe, and let's go through it properly. Start with the thing you have done 10,000 times without thinking about it. Your dog looks at your face. Try holding eye contact with almost any other mammal. A cow will disengage. A cat will hold it and treat the situation as loaded. A wolf, even one raised in a human household from 3 weeks old, will glance and look away. Because in most of the animal world, a fixed stare is a threat, an assessment, or the beginning of something unpleasant. Sustained mutual gaze between two adults of different species is close to unheard of. Dogs do it constantly, casually, and for no immediate reason. A dog will look at your face to check what you are doing, then follow where your eyes go, then look back at you. That behavior is doing something measurable. In 2015, Miho Nagasawa and colleagues at Azabu University in Japan published a study in Science that traced what happens chemically during those looks. Owners and dogs were put in a room together for half an hour, and urine was collected before and after to measure oxytocin, the hormone that underpins mammalian bonding, including the bond between a mother and a nursing infant. The pairs that gazed at each other the most showed the biggest rises. And it went both ways. The dog's gaze raised the owner's oxytocin, the owner responded with more touch and more talk, and the dog's own oxytocin then rose in turn. In a second experiment, the researchers gave dogs oxytocin nasally, and the dogs looked at their owners more, which raised the owner's levels again. A loop, in other words, running between two species, each one feeding the other. Then they ran the same protocol with hand-reared wolves living with the people who fed them daily. The wolves did not make the eye contact and the loop did not start. I should say that this finding has had a live argument around it ever since. A commentary the following year pointed out that the dog owners in the study were mostly women and the wolf handlers mostly men, and that human oxytocin responses to animals differ by sex, which muddies the neat species-level conclusion. That argument is not settled, but it is worth noticing what is being argued about. Nobody is disputing that the looking happens, or that it does something to both bodies. The debate is about how much of it is specific to dogs, which is a wonderful problem to have. Now look slightly higher, at the eyebrow. Dogs raise the inner corner of the brow. It is the movement that makes the eyes look larger and rounder, tips the face towards something infant-like, and happens to resemble what a human face does when sad. Everybody who has ever lived with a dog knows the expression. It is the one that gets the dog onto the bed. In 2019, Julianne Kaminsky at the University of Portsmouth and colleagues went and dissected the faces to find out what was producing it. In 6 dogs they found a distinct muscle running from the frontal bone to the skin of the inner brow, the levator anguli oculi medialis, well developed and clearly present. In the 4 gray wolves they examined, that muscle was mostly not there, represented by a few scant fibers and connective tissue. Behaviorally, when a human walked into the room, the dogs made the movement more often and more intensely, with the strongest versions produced only by dogs.
One dog in the study did not have the muscle. The Siberian Husky, an old breed sitting genetically close to the wolf end of things. The interpretation offered was elegant. Nobody bred for eyebrows. Nobody knew there was a muscle. But over thousands of years, in shelters and villages and camps, humans repeatedly chose the dog that looked back at them a certain way, fed it a little more, kept it a little longer, and that preference, applied invisibly across 1,000 generations, sculpted an anatomical structure whose only apparent job is to communicate with us. Then, in 2024, another team dissected coyotes and found a well-developed version of the same muscle, which reopens the question in an interesting direction. If coyotes have it and gray wolves largely do not, then the muscle may be an old canid feature that wolves lost, rather than something dogs invented. The expression is still real, the dogs still make it more than wolves do, and it still works on us.
But its origin story is being rewritten right now, in journals, which is roughly the most honest thing I can tell you about any of this. That is, the surface of the relationship. Underneath it is a set of skills the dog uses on us all day. Point at something across a room and a dog will look where you are pointing. That sounds trivial until you learn how rare it is. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, are famously poor at it and often need extensive training. Dogs do it as puppies, before much experience with people, and they do it with a whole grammar of variants. A pointed finger, a nod, a glance, a foot, a marker placed on the ground. This is not something they pick up from years of living with us. Emily Bray and colleagues at the University of Arizona tested 375 retriever puppies at around 8 weeks old, still living with their littermates, before any real one-on-one time with people.
The puppies already followed pointing gestures, already looked at human faces, already responded to human speech directed at them. And because every puppy's pedigree was known, the team could ask how much of the variation was inherited. Over 40% of the differences in point following and attention to faces was attributable to genetics. That is a startling result to sit inside. The willingness to look at a human face and take information from it is not a habit these animals acquire. It arrives installed, it varies between individuals, and it is passed to their puppies. They also track whether you can see them. Tell a dog not to take food, then turn your back, close your eyes, or leave the room, and the behavior changes according to what you are able to perceive. A dog is not just watching your body. It is modeling your attention. And when a problem becomes unsolvable, dogs do something wolves generally do not. They turn around and look at the human. Present a wolf with a sealed container of food, and it will work at the container until it gives up. Present a dog with the same container, and after a short attempt it looks back at your face, which is not a failure of persistence. It is a request. The dog's problem-solving strategy includes another species, which brings the nose into it, because the nose is where the dog stops being a slightly odd mammal and becomes something almost alien. A human nose carries something like 5 or 6 million olfactory receptor cells. A dog's carries in the order of 200 to 300 million, packed onto a labyrinth of scrolled bone at the back of the nasal cavity, and the region of the brain that processes what they report is proportionally many times larger than ours. The architecture is stranger than the numbers. When a dog inhales, a flap of tissue inside the nostrils splits the incoming air into 2 streams. One goes down to the lungs to be breathed. The other, a smaller fraction, is routed up into the olfactory recess,
where odor molecules are deposited and accumulate rather than being flushed out again. Breathing and smelling have been separated into two jobs on two paths, which means a dog can keep sampling a scent continuously without ever having to stop breathing. Even the exhale is engineered. Air leaves through slits at the sides of the nostrils, angled backwards and outwards, so the outgoing breath does not blow away the very scent the dog is trying to read, and in fact stirs up fresh molecules from the ground. The wetness of the nose is not decoration either. It captures and dissolves the molecules on arrival.
Then there is the sniff itself. Engineers at Penn State put dogs in front of instruments and measured it. And a sniff is not a big inhalation. It is a rapid burst, several per second, sometimes reaching hundreds of samples a minute, each one a discrete snapshot. A dog reading a lamppost is not inhaling a smell. It is taking a series of readings and assembling a picture, the way your eye assembles a scene out of saccades you never notice yourself making. There is an experiment that shows what all this is for better than any statistic. Researchers in Norway laid a fresh human trail across a field and let trained dogs pick it up at a point in the middle, giving them no clue about which direction the person had walked. The dogs sampled a handful of consecutive footprints and then turned and followed the correct way. Each print is a few seconds older than the next. The scent decays measurably in that time, and the dog reads the gradient across a few steps and derives a direction from it. Which means a dog's nose does not only report what is present, it reports what happened, and in what order, and how long ago. The smell of a room is, to a dog, closer to a timeline than to a fact. What that machinery achieves is difficult to hold in your head. Dogs have been shown to work with odor concentrations down around 1 or 2 parts per trillion. That is, 1 drop of a substance in a volume of water that would fill a couple of dozen Olympic swimming pools. And they do it in the open air, in wind, with 1,000 other smells present, and they can tell the target from the noise. We have spent the last 2 decades pointing that instrument at human bodies, and the results are still arriving. Trained dogs have been used to pick out samples from people with lung, breast, and colorectal cancers, with malaria, and with diabetes, at accuracies that in controlled conditions frequently run above 80 or 90%. During the pandemic, detection dogs were tested against laboratory tests on thousands of people. In one Colombian study, 5 dogs screened 848 people directly and identified infections with around 95% accuracy, and a negative from the dog was right more than 99% of the time. The dogs were reading a difference in body odor produced by an infection nobody had even named 18 months earlier. The seizure work is the one I find hardest to shake. Anecdotes about dogs warning their owners before an epileptic seizure have circulated for decades, always slightly out of reach of evidence. In 2019, Amelie Catala, working with the Medical Mutts organization in Indianapolis, collected sweat samples from 7 epilepsy patients, during a seizure, after exercise, and at rest. 5 shelter dogs were then asked to pick out the seizure samples they had never encountered before. 3 of them were correct every single time. The others were well above chance. What that study established is that a seizure has a smell. Not that dogs can predict one, which is a different and much harder claim that the researchers were careful not to make, and which the field is still working on. But there is a chemical signature to an event inside a human brain, and it reaches the surface of the skin, and there is an animal in the room that can read it. The reading goes wider than smell. Dogs match what they hear to what they see across senses. Shown 2 human faces, one happy and one angry, while a voice plays in an unfamiliar language stripped of words. They look longer at the face whose expression fits the tone. They are combining 2 channels into one judgment about a person's state, which is not a trick a dog needs for dog society at all. And they talk back, in a register they largely invented for us. Adult wolves bark rarely and briefly. Dogs bark constantly, in acoustically distinct patterns for strangers, for play, for isolation, for alarm, and humans with no training can sort recordings of those barks by context above chance. Somewhere in the last few tens of thousands of years, a quiet animal became a loud one, in a species-specific vocabulary aimed almost entirely at us. Now, the part that surprised me most in the research, which is what happens when we speak. In 2004, a border collie named Rico appeared in Science, knowing the names of more than 200 objects. When an unfamiliar word was used in front of a group of familiar toys, plus one new one, Rico fetched the new one, inferring that the new sound must belong to the thing without a name. Human children do exactly that, and the strategy has a name: fast mapping. It had not been expected outside our species. Rico turned out not to be the ceiling. John Pilley, a psychologist in South Carolina, spent 4 to 5 hours a day for 3 years with his own border collie, Chaser, and taught her the individual proper names of 1,022 objects. Not categories, names. Chaser could also separate the name from the command so that fetch the elephant, touch the elephant, and paw the elephant were understood as different instructions about the same object. And she could handle common nouns as categories, picking out a frisbee from a group of non-frisbees. Her handlers had to write the names on the toys to keep up. The dog did not. Border collies given thousands of hours are not typical dogs, and it is fair to ask what an ordinary household animal is actually doing when it hears you speak. 2 groups in Budapest have spent years answering that with brain imaging, working with dogs trained to lie motionless and awake in a scanner without restraint, which is its own remarkable achievement. Attila Andix and colleagues found that dogs process the 2 halves of speech in different hemispheres. Meaningful words, regardless of how they were said, showed up in the left hemisphere. Emotional intonation, regardless of the words, showed up on the right. That division is the same one human brains use. And the reward regions lit up strongest only when a praise word was delivered in a praise tone, meaning the dog was checking both channels and comparing them, which is a fair description of what it feels like to be caught saying "good boy" in a flat voice. Then, in 2024, Mariana Boros and Lila Majari's team went after the harder question. Not whether a dog reacts to a word, but whether the word calls up the thing. 18 ordinary pet dogs wore electrodes for a non-invasive recording. The owner would say a familiar object word, then hold up either that object or a different one. In the human version of this experiment, a mismatch between what you hear and what you then see produces a distinctive spike in brain activity, because your brain had already prepared for something specific and got something else. The dogs produced the same mismatch response, which means the word had generated an expectation, and expectations require a mental representation. When you say ball, something ball-shaped is already present in your dog's head before the ball is. The strength of that study is that it did not use gifted animals. It used ordinary dogs with ordinary vocabularies, and the effect held regardless of how many words a given dog knew. The capacity, as the authors put it, appears to be general to dogs rather than the property of a few prodigies. Whether it is truly the same operation that a 2-year-old child performs is a live and careful debate. But the recordings are the recordings, and something in there is doing more than reacting to a noise. Which raises an obvious question. Where did an animal like this come from, and how long has it been here? The answer has been rewritten repeatedly in the last 10 years, and it keeps getting older and stranger. In 2020, Anders Bergström, Pontus Skoglund, and a large international group sequenced 27 ancient dog genomes reaching back 11,000 years, and set them beside human genomes matched for time and place. Already at the end of the last ice age, before farming, before pottery, there were at least 5 deeply distinct dog lineages spread across the world. Which means the diversification had happened well before that. And dogs were already an established, widespread, ancient thing at a point most of us picture as the beginning. The same work showed something quietly moving. For long stretches of prehistory, dog ancestry moves the way human ancestry moves. When people migrated, their dogs traveled and mixed in the same pattern, at the same time, in the same directions. You can read part of the human story off the dogs, because for tens of thousands of years we did not go anywhere without them. And the record keeps getting pushed back.
In work published in 2026, the same laboratory reported genomes from a dog that lived around 14,200 years ago at Kesslerloch in Switzerland, extending the genetic record by roughly 5,000 years and showing that these Ice Age animals already belong to a population that contributed to later dogs worldwide. The oldest dog genomes we have all come from animals living alongside hunter-gatherers, across Europe and the Middle East, in a cold world with no villages in it. Genetics tells you when. Archaeology occasionally tells you what it felt like. In 1914, quarry workers near Bonn in Germany uncovered a grave holding a man, a woman, some worked objects of antler and bone, and a dog. It is roughly 14,000 years old. One of the oldest known burials of humans and a dog together. For most of a century, that was where the story stopped. Then researchers looked properly at the animal's teeth. The enamel carried the marks of severe illness, consistent with canine distemper, striking when the dog was about 19 weeks old and recurring across roughly 6 weeks. Distemper of that severity kills quickly. A puppy in that condition cannot hunt, cannot follow a group, cannot keep itself warm, and cannot drink without help. It survived that period, and lived to around 7 months. And then died and was buried with 2 people, which means somebody carried it. Somebody kept water in front of it, and kept it warm, and stayed with it through weeks in which it was useful for absolutely nothing. 14,000 years ago, in the late Paleolithic, a group of people who had every reason to be ruthless about resources chose to nurse a sick puppy that could not repay them, and when it died they put it in the ground with their own dead. That is not a domestication event. That is a relationship, and the emotional content of it is entirely legible across 14 millennia.
The collaboration then reshaped the animal from the inside as our own lives changed. When people began farming, human diets filled up with starch, and so did the food scraps around a settlement. Eric Axelson's team, comparing dog and wolf genomes in 2013, found the signature written in the digestive system. Dogs carry many extra copies of AMY2B, the gene for the pancreatic enzyme that breaks down starch, where wolves typically carry 2. Later work on ancient European dogs traced the expansion appearing in step with the spread of agriculture, thousands of years after domestication itself. The dog changed its metabolism to match our menu. Somewhere in there is the entire history of the relationship in a single enzyme. Whatever we started eating, they arranged to be able to eat too. Selection also fell heavily on genes involved in nervous system development, which is the polite scientific way of describing the temperament that lets a large carnivore sleep in a room with a toddler. Everything so far took tens of thousands of years. The part everybody pictures when they hear the word dog took about 150. The overwhelming majority of modern breeds are Victorian or later. Before that, dogs were sorted mostly by what they did, loosely and locally, and a sheepdog was any dog that could work sheep. The 19th century brought closed stud books, breed clubs, written standards, and shows. And within a few generations we produced the widest range of body shapes in any single mammal species on Earth. A Chihuahua and a Mastiff are the same species, capable in principle of producing fertile offspring, separated by a factor of 40 in body mass. Nothing else with a backbone does that. It is a genuinely astonishing piece of biological plasticity, and it came with an invoice. Selecting hard on appearance in small, closed populations concentrates whatever else those animals were carrying. Flat-faced breeds were selected for a skull shape people found appealing, and ended up with the soft tissue of a longer muzzle packed into a shorter one, which is why so many of them cannot breathe properly, cannot cool themselves efficiently in heat, and frequently need surgery to do what every other dog does for free. Large breeds carry hip and elbow problems. Deep-chested ones are prone to a stomach twist that can kill in hours. Several popular breeds carry inherited heart and eye disease at rates that would be considered a public health emergency in any other context. None of that makes those dogs less loved or less deserving. It does mean that the last chapter of this story was written unusually fast, by us, mostly in the last 2 centuries, largely on aesthetic grounds, and the animal has been paying the bill. The encouraging part is that it is reversible. Breed standards are being revised,
Breathing assessments are being introduced before breeding, and several national bodies have begun changing what wins in a ring. Selection made the problem in about 6 generations. Selection can unmake it in about the same. Meanwhile, the dog goes on doing what it has always done, which is turn up wherever we are. There are somewhere in the region of 1 billion dogs alive, and most of them are not pets in the sense that word carries in a European city. Most are free-ranging village and street dogs, living around people rather than inside their homes, doing roughly what the first ones did: staying close, cleaning up, raising the alarm, sleeping near the fire. The sofa is a recent innovation and a local one. The proximity is the ancient part, and it looks much the same in a village in Rajasthan as it did around a fire in the Paleolithic. And then there is the work. Dogs find people under collapsed buildings and under avalanches. They locate landmines and tumors and contraband and the specific individual who touched a door handle. They guide people who cannot see and warn people whose blood sugar is falling, and lie across the legs of a child having a panic attack. Almost none of that is instinct in any narrow sense. It is a general-purpose willingness to take a task from a human and treat it as the thing that matters, which is itself the strangest adaptation on the list. There is also a small, strange body of work on what happens when the traffic runs the other way, when the human is the one in trouble. In one study, dogs were placed outside a closed door, behind which their owner was either humming calmly or making distress sounds. Roughly a third of the dogs pushed the door open to get through, which is not a dramatic proportion until you look at the timing. The ones who opened it did so much faster when the person behind it sounded upset.
The researchers also measured stress in the dogs that did not open the door, and found that many of them were too distressed to act, which is a familiar enough experience to anyone who is frozen in an emergency. A Japanese team has reported something odder still, that dogs' eyes produce measurably more tear fluid at the moment they are reunited with their owner after a separation, and that oxytocin applied to the eye produces a similar effect. What that means is genuinely unclear, and one small study is one small study. But it is being investigated seriously, which tells you how far the questions about this animal have traveled from fetch and sit. So after all of it, what is the thing on the sofa? It is an animal with a nose that samples the air in bursts and can find a chemical present at 1 part in a trillion, and it uses that equipment mainly to keep track of where you have been. It has a muscle above its eye whose entire function appears to be making a face at you. It is running a chemical loop with you that neither of you can feel and both of you are inside. It has a word for the ball, and hearing the word puts a ball in its head. It came out of the Ice Age already ancient, and it has moved with our species across every continent we have ever walked onto. The thing I keep returning to is the bond burial. Not because it is old, but because of what it implies about the direction of the deal. We have spent this whole video looking at what the dog does for us, which is the usual way round. That grave is evidence from 14,000 years ago of the traffic going the other way, of people spending scarce effort on an animal that had nothing left to give them, apparently because they had become attached to it. That is the actual story of the dog, and it is much better than the version where we simply tamed a wolf. 2 species walked into a long conversation with no plan and no way to write anything down, and both came out changed.
They got starch enzymes, expressive faces, and a brain that expects our words to mean things. We got a companion species, and somewhere along the way, we became a kind of animal that grieves for a dog, which our ancestors were apparently already doing before anyone planted a field. So here is what I would like from you in the comments, and be specific. Tell me about the moment you realized your dog knew something you had not taught it. Not a trick. The thing it worked out on its own, about you, that you never intended to communicate. I read those, and they are consistently better than the studies. And if you want more animals taken apart at this level, with the papers named and the arguments included, subscribe. There is another one coming, and it is about a creature most people would rather not have in the house.